Hello and welcome to The Path to the Presidency. We're doing this in studio today, well, because basically Sumi and I haven't left here for about a week.
We live here now.
Yeah, we live here now. We've taken a presidency under the desk here in tiny little beds. Katty is with us as well. She's joining us remotely because she has managed to find the escape hatch out of the studio.
Yeah, listen, girls, ladies, you'll miss it when it's done, right? So you may as well enjoy
it. Oh, no, I'm loving it.
I don't think this story is going anywhere for the next 4 years. This is going to be a roller coaster.
No. And, you know, this, like, for what we do, this is our Super Bowl, our FA Cup final, our whatever Eurovision Song
Whatever
Contest.
the sports analogy is.
All rolled in together, isn't it? I mean, gosh, it was quite a night. I mean, I suppose the thing that people have been saying to me is, you know, the polls had this race really close, even though we were always warning about that margin of error, weren't we? That it could be anywhere between 1% and 4%. And looking at the states that have finished, those swing states, Donald Trump is ahead by between 1% and 4% in those swing states, except Arizona, which is still counting. And so far, he has a lead of 7% there, but there's still another 20% of votes to be tallied there. I mean, the result is not in question, but it's just how far ahead he was.
But if you look at what Tony Fabrizio, which is the Trump campaign's lead pollster, said, and we were talking about this before the election, Caitríona and Katty, I'm sure you had these conversations as well, their internal polling was telling them that Donald Trump was going to win by around the margins that we saw. And they were fairly confident. And of course, you know, you have the candidate himself perhaps not going in the direction that they wanted, he being a bit of a loose cannon, if you will, the week or two ahead of the election. And that probably was what was bringing in some of the uncertainty. But if you listen to interviews with the Trump campaign team, they were very clear that this was their election to win and perhaps theirs to lose. But they were confident about the numbers, weren't they?
Yeah, I think they were. I mean, what was surprising about the last week, and you're right about the margin of error, and we should probably always remind people about margins of error, although the margin of error would imply that, you know, it could go either way, whereas this time around it only went one way. So are the underlying numbers a bit out? But the Trump campaign was always super confident. Remember that. We were always saying, gosh, it's so strange. They're so confident. They're so confident they're going to win this. On election day, they were so confident. But what's odd is that the Harris campaign was also confident that last week. And I don't think they were bluffing us. I mean, I've reached out to various people to try and dig into these numbers, and I think they're also kind of traumatized. There is apparently a big Democratic retreat up in New York City this weekend with some kind of Democratic Party grandee. So I suppose we may get more that comes out of that. But they haven't really provided an explanation for why that last week they felt they were seeing things break their way. And actually, it seems like most people had already made their minds up before 2 weeks before the election. There just weren't that many people to make up their minds in that last week. So that's a kind of mystery to me still. I don't know if either of you have heard anything kind of persuasive from the Harris campaign about why they were so confident.
There's just a bit of radio silence, like you say, Katty, which I guess is kind of to be expected when, I mean, the word that keeps being said to me is shellacking. That's how it's being described, you know, like a complete wipeout between the presidency, flipping the Senate. And I mean, as we're talking now on Friday night, they're still counting the House, but it looks like the Republicans will keep control of that. Add into that conservative-leaning Supreme Court. So, you know, the Democrats are feeling very sorry for themselves and very sort of down and out. And it is a case, you know, obviously we heard from Joe Biden, we've heard from Kamala Harris and Tim Walz today as well, and very positive messaging and pep rally type of vibe. But they do have to figure out, where do they go from here? How do they pick themselves up? How did they get the message so wrong? How are they so out of touch with the voters?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we saw this on election night itself as we were all sitting here, and it got into the early hours of the morning. The recriminations already started, didn't they? And people asking questions about why it was that Donald Trump seemed to have won this so decisively, and that at this point, it looks like Donald Trump has won every swing state. We kept saying, of course, as you said, Katty, how close it was. And, you know, if you look at how the numbers break down, it was in some districts close. But the point is that Donald Trump was able to turn out a massive number of people. And, you know, why was the enthusiasm not there for the Democrats. And I know we've all seen various takes, and we're going to see takes probably for weeks, months, and maybe even years. I mean, maybe books are written about this election period, about what went wrong. They will be. Exactly. Sure. Maybe, we'll be talking about this 4 years from now. But regardless, I mean, there are so many points that are being made that I find really interesting. Of course, everything from was she the right candidate to, did she not distance herself enough from President Biden, to globally this backlash against incumbent governments. And I think one of the things that I think is going to be interesting to see is how Democrats take what their strategy was and run with that looking ahead to the midterms. Because, of course, we're always in the middle of an election campaign season in the U.S. 2 years from now, we're going to have midterms. And is it that they made a wrong turn to talk to Republican women and never Trump women and those who might have been kind of on the more conservative side and then ignored their more progressive and left-wing base? Or is it that they simply were not focusing on the issues that matter to everyday people? Things like, inflation, as we know, was the biggest issue here, or immigration, and that they didn't accept what those grievances were, name them, and try to address them. But I mean, obviously, here we are again, armchair analysts in a way, trying to break this down.
I mean, the fact of the matter is, to give Donald Trump his credit,
yes,
people picked him.
Yeah.
A majority of people in this country picked him. So the Democrats can go through all the machinations that they want, but maybe it was just a case that people preferred Donald Trump. They preferred what he's selling, that really clear core message that he had. Were you better off 4 years ago than you are now? And that message was subconsciously reinforced in the mind of every single person in this country every time they went to the grocery store.
Yeah.
And you paid for your groceries, and you saw, I mean, eggs was a big one. That's gone up 83% a dozen eggs in the last year.
Yeah.
It's hard to argue with those numbers when you're kind of thinking about who you're going to vote for.
I mean, I actually spent the day after the election, I went and spent some time with some very senior Democrats and somebody who'd been very senior in the Trump administration as well. And we were kind of all having this kind of post-mortem of what went on. And they all mentioned all of the things that you've talked about come up, the global atmosphere, all of these incumbents being thrown out. We've all seen the FT article by now that, for the first time in 120 years, in the 10 biggest elections this year, the incumbent didn't survive. And was it just that? There was not a chance for any Democrat, whether it be Kamala Harris, Josh Shapiro, Andy Beshear, any of the others who might have done it, to get through. The inflation that you've both mentioned that we talked a lot about, particularly rents, because that rents affects low-income workers more than it affects college-educated, higher-income people in the country. That had a big impact. Not running hard enough against a culture of kind of political correctness that people felt they were being sneered at, which is, I mean, I remember this story for decades in America, that people in the heartland of the country felt they were looked down upon by the elites in the media. Yeah. That's not a news story, although it may have been exacerbated by Me Too and the Black Lives Matter movement. But the one thing that these officials from both sides, and none of them were keen on Trump, I have to put that out there, but very senior Republican strategist, somebody that worked in the George W. Bush administration, somebody who'd worked for Donald Trump, the one thing they all pointed to was Joe Biden. And that if there is one source of kind of something that should have been done differently, it was not actually this summer, it was a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
And that Joe Biden should have given the party a chance to find, not just to find the best political athlete, which is what primaries do, they force people to become political athletes, but also to get more of a reading from primary voters, in other words, the American public, about what their priorities were. And I guess that was the sort of original sin of the Democratic Party in 2024.
I think if you look back to the midterms of 22 as well, the Democrats did so well then that I think that allowed space for a viewpoint in the mind of Joe Biden. I can't guess what goes on through his mind, obviously, but in the broader Democratic opinion base, that Joe Biden was able to say, I beat Donald Trump in 2020. I beat Donald Trump, MAGA Republicans, in 2022. I'm the guy for the race in 2024. And that sort of shut down his critics, and it shut down any debate on having a primary season or of replacing him as the candidate.
I keep thinking about that split screen of 2 years ago, and I was here covering the midterms, and you had on the one hand Joe Biden, who emerged and kind of took this victory lap after the midterm elections and said, oh, that red wave never materialized. And on the other hand, you had have Donald Trump and his team, who almost all of his hand-picked candidates, think of people like Dr. Oz, think of people like Blake Masters in Arizona, they underperformed, they failed. And the only person who succeeded, or one of the only people who succeeded in that midterms, was J.D. Vance. He was one Donald Trump endorsed candidate who did well, and of course he then ended up joining the ticket. But that was kind of the ebb of Donald Trump's power, if you will, in that period of time. And you remember he announced that he was running in this full ballroom, and then the networks cut away because he was rambling a bit. And you really thought, is this going to, what is the Republican Party going to do here? But split, or fast forward rather to today, and you see just this incredible, we keep calling it comeback, right? I mean, it's an amazing comeback for Donald Trump. And I guess, we can look ahead a little bit maybe and talk a bit about what we think we can expect from who's going to be in his administration. We know now Susie Wiles, Chief of Staff, but also what kind of emphasis or focus there'll be this time around that will be different. What do you think, Katty?
So I think the key is what you've just put your finger on, Sumi, and that is who's in the administration, because I think that will tell us the direction that Donald Trump is going to take. I mean, the question all through the last few weeks, for Democrats in particular, but for Republicans and for Trump supporters as well, is how much is Donald Trump going to deliver on the message of his campaign? Is he going to do some of the more draconian things he's talked about, like use the military against his political enemies, prosecute some of his political enemies, try to shut down cable television networks that he doesn't like, do the mass deportations? I mean, we're starting to get the contours of some of that, but I think what will really tell us that is who is in some of the key positions. Who is the Attorney General? Who is the Secretary of Defense? Who is the Secretary of State in terms of the rest of the world and what it means for them? I mean, this official that I spoke to from the Trump administration had pretty extraordinary scenes of people who were, Donald Trump's chief of staff, senior people from the military, standing around Donald Trump in the Oval Office whilst Donald Trump, for example, talked about using the American army against protesters after George Floyd was killed, and could he invoke the Insurrection Act? And this official said it was, multiple times that he raised this issue, and their thinking was this is something he would like to do. This is a kind of his tendency is towards doing that. So that would be one of the more extreme things that Donald Trump might do. Who will be in the room to say, yes, Mr. President, under the Insurrection Act, you can and should do this? And who will be in the room saying, actually, Mr. President, it's worth holding back here, because once you put American soldiers on the streets, these soldiers have been trained to shoot and kill people, and those could be Americans that get shot and killed. And that may not be good for the country, and it may not be good for your administration and how this looks. So I think we don't know yet. I mean, there's one appointment that a couple of interesting things, and we should talk about the Elon Musk call with Zelensky, because I've had a couple of people who were in the previous Trump administration text me about that. But I think Bob Lighthizer, who was the former trade representative, going back as trade representative, that has been reported now. That would suggest that Donald Trump's love of tariffs, as he's called him, he loves the word tariffs, that is something that he really is going to do. Now, the percentage we don't know, but it looks, I think you'll have a lot of countries around the world looking at Bob Lighthizer going back as trade representative, and companies who have overseas production capacity looking at that and thinking, okay, we need to anticipate that this is an administration that promises made, promises kept. There will be a tariff regime from the Trump administration. Yeah. I don't know. Can you read much more else into who we've got? Because Susie Wiles, to me, seems fundamentally unideological. Yeah. So I'm not sure we can read too much into her appointment.
I think what we can read into her appointment is that she's very organised. She knows Donald Trump very well. He clearly trusts her. He considers her to be a loyalist. We know how highly he values loyalty. And, traditionally that chief of staff role is the gatekeeper to the Oval Office. You have to get through the chief of staff to get to the president. And a lot of criticism in Trump White House Mark I was how loose things were and how everyone had access to Donald Trump and it wasn't streamlined. His access to information wasn't kind of controlled. So I think we may see a more traditional administration.
Can I say it was crazy, you could go to the West, and I did it. You could go to the West Wing for an appointment with, say, Jared Kushner or somebody else or Hope Hicks or somebody else. And if you happen to be passing the Oval Office, you could just wander in there. I mean, it was really extraordinary, the degree to like it was kind of leaky sieve of people going in and out with pretty much constant access to the president if they wanted it.
Yeah, so I think we'll see a change there with Susie Wiles.
That may be a good thing.
Yeah, the other thing I think we can tell at this point, I mean, Sumi, you and I have had so many people come through the studio in the past few days who are Trump surrogates and who are very close to the president and are speaking for him. The two things that keep coming up are tariffs, as we've mentioned, and the number of 20% being a kind of across the board, maybe higher for China. I mean, they've been talking about 60% on Chinese goods. So that's one thing I think we will see pretty early on. And the other thing is this issue of deportations. I mean, Donald Trump talking about mass deportations on day one. Again, I've noticed a change in the messaging from the people we've been interviewing where they're now talking about criminals in the first stage, convicted criminals. And when we've been pushing back and saying, well, you know, what about families or people who have children with an American citizen, etc. And, you know, we'd heard about these camps and so on, that they're not really engaging on that point. They're talking about criminals. And, you know, we've heard reference from Donald Trump on the campaign trail a few times to invoking this Alien Enemies Act from 1798, and more than 200 years old piece of legislation that allows a president and administration to deport people from countries it considers to be at war with, or, you know, convicted criminals and so on. So I think we will see them move on that part. And, you know, Donald Trump is an individual who's always looking for wins. He likes to be able to say, I did something and I've delivered upon it. So I think there are two things that we will see happen quite quickly.
I just really wonder about the logistics of the deportation operation. That's something, as you said, Caitríona, we keep asking guests as they come on the air, how exactly is this going to work? And, you know, Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida, who we know is a big Trump surrogate and is close to the Trump world. Well, he was saying, yeah, exactly. Our priority is to start with convicted criminals, those who have committed crimes here in the U.S., those who we know are here with, you know, transnational criminal gangs. But the numbers simply don't add up. If you listen to what Donald Trump was saying on the campaign trail, he was, you know, going between 2 million people and 20 million people at some point, I think he said, which obviously very, very loose range there. And when they actually talk about the convicted criminals and those who have entered the country and have committed crimes here, the numbers ranged up to 500,000 people. So there's clearly a very big gap there. And I asked Byron Donalds specifically this question about families, and he said something to the extent of, well, you know, there are people who have crossed in and children who have joined up with people who are not their parents. That then raises the question, what do mass DNA tests to see who's a family? And interestingly, I was looking at some numbers from the Department of Homeland Security together with Pew Research, and they estimated around 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country right now. And they say that 4/5 of those people are long-term undocumented people, meaning they've been here more than a decade.
And many of them have children here.
Exactly. And that's where it gets a lot more vague when they talk about it.
I mean, I think that's, you know, I mean, the numbers is interesting because, look, at one point during an interview, Donald Trump was asked about tariffs and he said, well, I say 100%, it could be 200%, it could be 500%, right? Numbers are fungible. I think we've realized this with Donald Trump in the first administration. It's going to be a question of what he takes as a win on this, what he thinks is enough to satisfy the promises that he made, the hawks on this issue like Stephen Miller in his administration, and does he want to actually deport, you know, all people who are here illegally, or does he want a political victory early on in his administration, like the Muslim registry list that he had, the Muslim ban that he had in the very early days of 2016? I suspect what he doesn't want is something that captures images that are repeatedly played on television very early on that incite criticism of the administration and maybe even spook financial markets, which happened a little because it looks chaotic. He would like this to be orderly and something that the American people approve of, not disapprove of. And it could, if you're starting to separate children on camera and you've got pictures every night of kids crying, that's something I think even people who voted for Donald Trump are not. We saw it last time. They didn't love it when he separated families at the border. It turned against him. So I think he's going to be careful to avoid those scenes, which would suggest that they probably go, and maybe they stop with just those people who have committed crimes in the country.
So I'll be looking closely to see who is appointed as the Secretary for Homeland Security, because whomever that individual is, whether they were, right beside Donald Trump on the campaign and what their view is about what we're discussing, I think will be a big tell in terms of what that will look like on the couple of early days of the administration. And
we've heard names like Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think, and Vivek Ramaswamy are a few names that have been floated, but that's still open.
One other question, just kind of generally on all of these appointments, because there is one thought from speaking to a kind of senior Republican strategist who was actually with the Bush administration, is not a Trump fan, but is still pretty well connected. He was saying you could end up in a position where actually the cabinet offices don't matter that much. Because if Donald Trump feels that he's going to have any problem getting through people through the Senate who are hard to be confirmed, actually the people who really, this could be a very White House centric administration in the way that it was in the first Trump administration, where real power is held by people who are loosely termed advisors or counselors to the president. And whether it's, the Stephen Millers or the Kash Patels of the world, people who are more in line with hardline MAGA thinking, but who might not be confirmed. And actually they're in the Oval Office or near the Oval Office talking to the president every day, and they're the ones making policy.
Yeah, I think we will see sort of special envoy roles like we saw with Jared Kushner in the first Trump administration, because again, the president-elect obviously very close to his son, Donald Jr. There's much talk of what role Donald Jr. will have in the White House. So I think we'll see him in that sort of Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump type of role, where they have a lot of power and a lot of access, but maybe a not so definite kind of lane that they're to be taken care of. So we'll wait to see. And I mean, we mentioned briefly Elon Musk earlier.
That's
and I mean,
so interesting.
That is incredibly interesting. And this reporting that's coming in from many media outlets now that he was on that first call between Donald Trump and President Zelensky the other day as well. I mean, we know that Elon Musk obviously owns Starlink, which has been a big part of the war in Ukraine. In terms of how Ukraine is using it for drones to strike at Russian targets, but also because he did come up with a sort of peace plan, he was calling it, for Ukraine early on into this, the Russian invasion. So, I mean, was that what they were talking about? It's just, I mean, we always say Donald Trump has thrown out all the playbooks, right, in campaigning and in governing, and it seems to be a further reinvention of Trump 2.0 that we're seeing now.
Yeah, what do you make of this, Katty? I mean, what are sources telling you about the role that Elon Musk might play?
So I got a text just before the show, actually, from somebody who said that it is pretty, I'm just reading it because it literally came as we came on air, from somebody who had been in the Trump administration first time around, who will not be going back into the Trump administration, but who was just saying, look, it's pretty incredible, actually, that Musk was on that call, that it's highly unusual to have what he calls a civilian get that kind of access to a call like that would potentially be so sensitive. And I think one thing we have realized is that Elon Musk is going to be an incredibly important figure in this administration. He's won over the confidence of the president. He, of course, and this is going to be interesting to watch how this plays out without breaching any rules. What kind of role is he going to have in the administration? Is it formal? And then in that case, if he is trying to get more government contracts, defense contracts for Starlink, is that in line with legislation? Is it not in line with legislation? How do they get round that? Is he lobbying for his own company if he's in the administration? I think one real tell for me was the incredibly sort of unctuous text of congratulations that Jeff Bezos, who also has his own, space company and satellite company interests, sent to Donald Trump immediately after he was elected president. And to see these two kind of titans of American innovation and business, both of them billionaires, vying for the president's confidence and attention, I think is really interesting and an indication of how businesses in this country are going to do what they can to curry favor with Donald Trump because they believe that it is in their own business interests.
I think that's pretty standard practice, though, isn't it, when a new president is elected, that business leaders want to make contact and world leaders do as well. I mean, the word coming from...
I think it's unusual to see business... I haven't seen business leaders with such fulsome kind of
publicly, perhaps.
I mean, public tweets of, you're my guy. I'm so excited for you. I mean, that it was more than I had seen in previous elections.
Yeah,
and it's just because Bezos is in a position of competition with Musk that it's interesting.
Right. Yeah. No, that's true. And I guess we'll keep looking ahead to see what happens with the Trump administration. They feel like they have a mandate now to do all of these policies with the victory that they have. So.
Well, they do have a mandate.
And they do.
Yeah. The American people have spoken. Nearly 75 million of them have. Or 74 million, I think it is at this point, with votes still being counted, have said yes to Donald Trump. But we're out of time for now. Great as always chatting to you. We could go for another 2 hours, I think. Lots more to talk about. But we will have to leave it there. Sumi and Katty, we will chat again soon. And that is it for The Path to the Presidency for today. Thanks so much for being with us. Talk soon.